Episode 3, H. Holmes, The Confession, Execution, and the Jack the Ripper Theory. After years of deception, fraud, and murder, H. Holmes now stood in the one place he could not charm his way out of, the courtroom. The man who'd spent a lifetime manipulating, scheming, and eliminating those who got in his way was finally facing justice. But if anyone expected remorse, they would be sorely mistaken. H. Holmes on trial. The judge. Do you have any final words before sentencing, Mr. Holmes? The man at the defendant's table didn't flinch. His lips curled into a slight smile as if he'd found the whole thing amusing. The courtroom was silent, waiting for his response. H. Holmes calmly says, "I was born with the devil in me." A shudder ran through the packed courtroom. Holmes was no ordinary criminal. He wasn't just admitting guilt, he was embracing it. The judge's voice rang out as he delivered the inevitable sentence. Herman Webster Mudgett, also known as H. Holmes, you are sentenced to death by hanging. As the courtroom erupted, Holmes barely reacted. The only thing that changed was the widening of his eerie smile. He spent a lifetime controlling his own fate, yet here he was, days away from the gallows. And still, he remained in control of the narrative, spinning lies, making contradictory confessions, and even suggesting he might escape death itself. Hello, I'm Jay Nichol, Nichol Investigations. This is Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast. Ontario Cold Cases is a gripping true crime podcast that shines a light on unsolved murders, disappearances, and forgotten crimes from across the province and the world. With meticulous research, compelling storytelling, and a commitment to historical accuracy, we bring you the real stories of victims, investigators, and suspects, stories that demand to be heard. Each week, we take you deep into the world of true crime with a packed schedule of episodes. Tuesdays, historical true crime cases, exploring infamous and obscure crimes from history. Wednesdays, the Mick and Mac Mysteries, a thrilling fictional detective series set in 1950s Toronto. Thursdays, World Cold Case Thursday, investigating unsolved cases from around the globe. Sundays, Ontario Cold Cases, the latest episode uncovering an unsolved mystery from Ontario. From high-profile crimes that shock the nation to little-known cases waiting for justice, we uncover the truth, one case at a time. Join us as we explore the dark corners of history and mystery, where every clue could lead to answers and every case deserves a second look. Subscribe now wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts and never miss an episode of Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast. Segment 1, The Trial and Execution, the most sensational trial of the century. In October 1895, Holmes's trial began in Philadelphia. Though officially charged with the murder of Benjamin Petzl, the trial was about far more than one life. It was about the horrifying possibility that Holmes had left a trail of bodies stretching from Chicago to Canada. The prosecution painted Holmes as a cold-blooded killer who had not only murdered Petzl, but also his 3 children. Witnesses, including Carrie Petzl, took the stand and recounted how Holmes deceived her into believing her husband was alive. When detectives testified about the bodies of Alice and Nellie, found in Toronto, and the charred remains of Howard Petzl in Indianapolis, the jury was visibly shaken. Holmes's defense, the master manipulator to the end. Holmes, ever the con man, acted as his own attorney for part of the trial. He spoke with eloquence, using his trademark charm in an attempt to sway the jury. He claimed he was nothing more than a businessman, a misunderstood man caught in a storm of media hysteria, but the mountain of evidence was undeniable. His fraudulent schemes had been exposed, the insurance scam had unraveled, the bodies of the Petzel children left no doubt about his guilt. The verdict and sentence. After just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was death by hanging. Holmes received the ruling with unsettling calm, as if he'd already planned for every possible outcome. The chilling confessions. Truth or fiction? As the executioner's noose loomed closer, H. Holmes did what he did best. He controlled the narrative. In the months leading up to his hanging, he decided to finally tell all. But in true Holmes fashion, it's not the truth he was telling. Instead, he played a final game of deception, spinning a web of contradictions, half-truths, and outright fabrications that left investigators, reporters, and the public questioning what was real and what was just another grand illusion. The 27-page confession, a killer's last scam. Holmes' confession was first published in April 1896 in newspapers across the country. It was a 27-page document handwritten by the killer himself, detailing 27 murders that he claimed to have committed. Some of these names were familiar: Alice, Nellie, and Howard Petzel, Benjamin Petzel, and Emmeline Sigrand. But others were complete fabrications. People who had never existed or who were very much alive. Holmes boldly claimed to have killed an old Philadelphia doctor, who later walked into a police station very much alive and thoroughly confused. He claimed to have murdered business associates, only for the newspapers to track them down in other cities, living normal lives. Some names he listed as victims were people whose bodies had never been found, leaving their fates uncertain to this day. This confession, rather than bringing closure, only deepened the mystery surrounding Holmes. Was he truly admitting to his crimes? Or was he embellishing his story, feeding the legend of America's first serial killer to cement his own infamy? The elaborate lies and changing stories. But if 27 murders weren't enough, Holmes didn't stop there. In private interviews, he contradicted himself repeatedly, sometimes inflating his number of victims to 100 or more. Other times, he denied any guilt at all. In one interview, he admitted to killing dozens of people. In another, he claimed complete innocence, insisting that he had only ever been guilty of fraud. At one point, he blamed the devil himself, saying he'd been possessed since birth. The ever-changing narrative became one of the most puzzling aspects of Holmes's legacy. Was he a killer in control of his own story, or was he unraveling under the weight of his crimes? Up next, was he a serial killer or a liar? Was he a serial killer or a liar? While the confession contained provable truths, it was also filled with fabrications that suggested Holmes was enjoying his final deception, one last con before his death. The true number of his victims remains unknown to this day. Some historians believe he killed no more than 9. Others suggest the real count could be over 200. But one thing is certain: Holmes knew exactly how to keep people talking about him long after he was gone. His final prison statement, a cryptic last word. As his execution date loomed, Holmes delivered one last ominous message. He claimed that his face was changing, that he was becoming something else. Reporters who visited him in prison wrote that his once charming features had twisted into something monstrous. His lips curled into a permanent sneer, his eyes seemed darker, more hollow, as if his own evil was consuming him from the inside out. H. Holmes, in a prison statement, stated, "I am beginning to resemble the devil." The statement sent a shudder through those who read it. Was it a final theatrical flourish, or did Holmes truly believe he was transforming into something inhuman? The psychological mystery of H. Holmes. Even in death, Holmes remained an enigma. Was he a cold, calculating serial killer? A pathological liar who enjoyed toying with the public? Or was he something more? A man who blurred the line between myth and reality, ensuring his story would never be forgotten. As he approached the gallows, his smile never faded. Whatever truth he knew, he would take it with him to the grave. H. Holmes's execution. The devil goes to the gallows. On May 7th, 1896, Holmes was led to the gallows on Moy-Messing Prison in Philadelphia. The executioner placed a noose around his neck as reporters gathered, waiting for his final words. "I am only guilty of one crime, the crime of being too ambitious." The trapdoor beneath him dropped, but even in death, Holmes managed to defy expectations. Unlike most executions where the neck breaks instantly, Holmes slowly strangled for over 15 minutes, his body twisting, his fingers twitching, as the crowd watched in morbid fascination. It was a gruesome, drawn-out death, almost as if the devil himself refused to let him go easily. Up next, the theory that H. Holmes was Jack the Ripper. The theory that H. Holmes was Jack the Ripper. One of the most controversial theories about H. Holmes, that he was also Jack the Ripper, the infamous serial killer who terrorized London in 1888. While it's an intriguing possibility, the theory lacks solid evidence and is widely debated among historians and true crime enthusiasts. Let's take a deep dive into the connections, arguments for and against the theory, and the truth behind it. The origins of the theory. The theory that H. Holmes and Jack the Ripper were the same person gained attention primarily because of Holmes' known history as a serial killer, one of the first documented American serial murderers. Similarities in their killings. Both killers had a gruesome, methodical approach to murder. Holmes' descendant, Jeff Mudgett, revived the theory in recent years. Key events that propelled the theory. In 2011, Jeff Mudgett, H. Holmes' great-great-grandson, published the book Bloodstains, claiming Holmes was also Jack the Ripper. In 2017, the theory gained mainstream attention when it was featured in the History Channel documentary, American Ripper. In 2018, Mudgett claimed to have had handwriting evidence linking Holmes to the Ripper letters. The similarities between H. Holmes and Jack the Ripper. Number 1, both were serial killers. Holmes and the Ripper were both methodical and intelligent killers. Each targeted vulnerable victims. Holmes preyed on women and business partners, while the Ripper targeted prostitutes. Number 2, both had surgical knowledge. Holmes had a medical degree from the University of Michigan, where he studied human anatomy and dissection. The Ripper was suspected to be a doctor, butcher, or someone with anatomical expertise because he skillfully removed organs from his victims. Number 3, the timeline. Did Holmes travel to London? The Whitechapel murders occurred between August and November 1888. Holmes was active around the same time in the U.S. Some theorists claim there is a gap in Holmes' documented whereabouts in 1888, leaving room for the idea that he may have traveled to London. And number 4, the use of fake identities. Holmes frequently used aliases to avoid detection, similar to how the Ripper taunted police while remaining unidentified. The problems with the theory, why it's unlikely. While the theory is enticing, several key issues cast doubt on the idea that Holmes and the Ripper were the same person. There's no documented travel records. There is no concrete proof that Holmes was ever in London in 1888. Holmes was known to be running his various fraud schemes in Chicago and Philadelphia at the time. Travel records from 1888 do not show Holmes boarding a ship to England. Different motives. Holmes was a con artist first, a killer second. He killed for a financial gain, eliminating witnesses and insurance fraud victims. Jack the Ripper's murders were gruesome, but had no financial motive. His killings appeared to be ritualistic or sexually driven. Holmes's murders were carefully premeditated, while the Rippers were impulsive and frenzied. And the different methods of murder. H. Holmes preferred gassing, strangulation, and poison. He killed victims in private, usually in his murder castle. He dissected bodies for profit, selling skeletons to medical schools. Jack the Ripper, he butchered his victims in public spaces, used a knife to slash throats and disembowel victims. The Ripper did not profit from his crimes, he simply killed and vanished. There's different psychological profiles. Holmes was a manipulative sociopath. His charm and intelligence allowed him to deceive victims into trusting him. Jack the Ripper was likely a disorganized, sadistic killer. He struck quickly and vanished without a trace. Holmes was in the U.S. in 1888. There's clear evidence that Holmes was operating his pharmacy in Chicago in 1888. He was involved in real estate transactions and scams that placed him in the U.S. at the time. The handwriting evidence, does it prove anything? One of the most widely cited pieces of evidence for the Holmes-Ripper connection is a handwriting analysis that allegedly compares Holmes's letters and the Ripper's taunting letters to police, like the Dear Boss letter. What was the result? Some experts claimed there were similarities, while others dismissed the findings as inconclusive. The Ripper letters are widely believed to be hoaxes written by journalists, meaning even if the handwriting matched, it wouldn't prove Holmes was the Ripper. Other theories. Could Holmes have been an accomplice? Some alternative theories suggest that Holmes may have had a disciple or accomplice in London who carried out the Ripper killings on his behalf. Holmes may have inspired a correspondent with someone in London, sharing his knowledge of anatomy. The Ripper killings could have been a practice run for Holmes, refining his ability to kill before opening the murder castle in Chicago. However, there is no hard evidence to support these ideas. So the final verdict was Holmes Jack the Ripper? Extremely unlikely. No travel records, witness accounts, or evidence place Holmes in London in 1888. Their killing methods, motives, and psychological profiles were different. The theory was largely popularized by Holmes' descendant Jeff Mudgett, rather than based on solid historical evidence. What's more likely? Jack the Ripper was probably a local resident in London, possibly a butcher, medical student, or doctor. Holmes was busy running scams in the U.S. at the time of the Ripper murders. The theory persists because of the mysterious nature of both killers, but there is no definitive connection between them. Final thoughts on the Jack the Ripper theory. The idea that H. Holmes was Jack the Ripper is fascinating, but there's no credible proof to support it. While both were cunning and dangerous men, they operated in completely different ways and with different motives. The theory makes for a compelling story, but history and evidence strongly suggest that Holmes never left the U.S. during the Ripper killings. Up next, a psychological profile. The psychological profile. H. Holmes was a ruthless, calculating murderer, using deception, charm, and cold-blooded logic to kill for a financial gain. Unlike most serial killers, he did not kill for pleasure or compulsion, but as a means to an end, profiting from his victims through insurance fraud, theft, or silence. H. Holmes' psychological profile, the mind of a serial killer. H. Holmes was not just a serial killer. He was a master manipulator, con artist, and pathological liar. His crimes are cold, calculated, and financially motivated, setting him apart from many modern serial killers who kill for emotional gratification or compulsion. To understand Holmes, we need to examine his psychological makeup, looking at his personality traits, behaviors, and possible mental disorders. Number 1 is key personality traits. Holmes exhibited a number of traits that are commonly found in psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, including, number 1, lack of empathy. Holmes had no remorse for his victims, including children. He lied and manipulated people without guilt. Even when caught, he showed no genuine remorse, often smirking and making jokes. Number 2, extreme manipulation and deception. Holmes was a highly skilled manipulator, capable of convincing people to trust him. He lied with ease, using charm and intelligence to win over investors, business partners, and romantic interests. He tricked Carrie Petzel into believing her husband was still alive while murdering her children. Number 3, superficial charm. People described Holmes as charismatic, articulate, and well-dressed. He talked his way out of trouble and convinced people to follow his schemes. Even in prison, he charmed guards and reporters, writing a self-serving autobiography that painted himself as a misunderstood genius. Number 4, narcissism and grandiosity. Holmes saw himself as superior to others, believing he was smarter than police and society. He loved attention, even confessing to 27 murders, some of which he likely did not commit, just to stay in the spotlight. He built an elaborate murder castle not just to kill, but to create a sense of control and power. And number 5, calculated and predatory nature. Unlike impulsive killers, Holmes carefully planned his crimes. He chose victims strategically, killing for a financial gain or to eliminate witnesses. He built a massive multi-layered scheme involving business fraud, insurance scams, and murder. Possible diagnosis. What was wrong with Holmes? Psychologists have retrospectively analyzed Holmes' behavior and classified his potential mental disorders. Psychopathy. Holmes fits the classic definition of a psychopath, showing lack of empathy, superficial charm, pathological lying, manipulation of others, lack of guilt or remorse. Modern equivalent. Holmes' personality aligns with antisocial personality disorder, specifically the psychopathic subtype. Narcissistic personality disorder. Grandiose sense of self-importance. Belief in his own superiority. Exaggerated confidence in his ability to fool others, and he loved media attention. Even at his execution, Holmes maintained an air of arrogance. He did not beg for his life, but instead made sarcastic remarks to the executioner. Possible sadistic personality disorder. Holmes derived pleasure from controlling and deceiving people, but was he truly sadistic? Unlike most serial killers, Holmes did not kill for pleasure, but he may have enjoyed the suffering of his victims. The murder castle suggests a desire for control and cruelty as he created intricate traps for his victims. The conclusion? Holmes likely had some sadistic tendencies, but his primary motivation was financial and strategic, not purely sadistic pleasure. So, in comparison to other serial killers, Holmes is very different from most modern serial killers, especially those who kill for psychological gratification. H. Holmes was fraud and financial gain. He was a psychopath, manipulator, with no remorse. Ted Bundy. He was a sexual sadist and power. He's a psychopath, narcissist, and impulsive. Jeffrey Dahmer, necrophilia and control. He was deeply disturbed with severe trauma. John Wayne Gacy, sexual compulsion, a psychopath, and a sadist. So why was Holmes different? He didn't kill for emotional reasons. His killings were rational and methodical. He lacked sexual motivation. Many serial killers kill for sexual gratification. But Holmes killed for profit and secrecy. He was a fraudster first, a killer second. His crimes were rooted in deception and financial scams before they escalated to murder. Did Holmes believe he would get caught? Holmes was extremely arrogant and thought he was too intelligent to be caught. He constantly changed locations, using fake names, disguises, and elaborate cover stories. Even after his arrest, he thought he could manipulate the justice system. He wrote an autobiography hoping to profit off his crimes. However, his overconfidence led to mistakes. He failed to keep track of his lies, leading authorities to connect his different aliases. He left behind witnesses such as Carrie Petzel, who later helped expose him. His inability to resist fraud and con games eventually led insurance companies to investigate him, which unraveled his murder schemes. Holmes' last days. Did he show any remorse? As Holmes awaited execution, he never truly admitted guilt. He continued manipulating the press, giving contradictory confessions. At one point, he claimed he had no choice but to kill. He told reporters that he felt no guilt and had the devil in him. Before he was hanged, he remained eerily calm, joking with the executioners. Final thoughts. Who was H. Holmes really? Holmes was not just a serial killer. He was a con artist first, a murderer second. His primary motivation was always mind deception. He lacked any real emotional depth, viewing people as tools for his financial schemes. He was not an impulsive killer, but a calculating one, choosing his victims carefully. He thrived on manipulation, creating elaborate lies, fake businesses, even a fake death scheme to get what he wanted. Was he insane? No. Holmes was fully aware of his actions. He knew right from wrong. He just didn't care. He actively covered up his crimes, proving he was not delusional or suffering from psychosis. So was he a genius? He was highly intelligent, but not a criminal mastermind. His frauds were clever, but he made mistakes. His overconfidence led to his downfall. And so, the devil went to the gallows. On May 7th, 1896, H. Holmes met his fate at the end of a noose. But even in death, he refused to play by the rules. His slow, agonizing execution only added to the legend of a man who seemed determined to defy fate itself. Yet for all his cunning, for all his lies and schemes, Holmes' story did not end with his final breath. His chilling confessions, both real and fabricated, continue to haunt us. His murder castle may be long gone, but the mysteries surrounding his crimes remain. Did he truly kill 27 people? Or were there more victims lost to history? What about his most infamous connection? Was he merely a fraudster and murderer? Or could he have also been Jack the Ripper? Holmes' body was exhumed in 2017. And what forensic experts found was just as strange as the man himself. His remains were eerily well preserved, his mustache still intact after more than a century in the ground. Was it just an oddity of science? Or had he somehow cheated death one last time? If you enjoyed this episode of Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a case. We're available wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. And if you're fascinated by history's most cunning criminals, stay tuned for more deep dives into Canada's and the world's most chilling true crime cases. Have a case you want us to cover? Send us a message. We're always looking for the next great mystery to unravel. Thanks for listening, and remember, the past is never as far away as it seems.